Hello, everyone, and welcome to ACMA's Importance of Diversity and Inclusion in the Healthcare Ecosystem webinar. My name is Caitlin Calvo, and I am the Associate Director of Customer Success. For those of you joining us for the first time, welcome, and for those of you who have joined us previously on previous webinars, welcome back. As many of you know, we are the Accreditation Council for Medical Affairs, and our mission is to really establish a higher level of global independent standards of excellence across the board throughout the pharmaceutical environment and within medical affairs. That being said, today we are going to be discussing some very important issues surrounding diversity in clinical trials. We will review why diversity is important in scientific research and the FDA's guidance on race and ethnicity. There is also an exciting discussion on the challenges and benefits of decentralized clinical trial model from experts in the field. So to begin on this webinar today, we have ACMA Life Sciences Associate Dr. Kiana Dixon. She will be our moderator of this conversation today. And we are also joined by two very special guests, Dr. Tania Small, the VP of Global Medical Oncology and Head of R&D Inclusion Diversity Council at GSK. And we also have Dinah Trevil, the Senior Program Director at Stanford Cancer Institute. So we have the experts here for you to discuss these very important topics. So welcome, ladies. Just wanted to say welcome. And before we get started, I would love to hear, of course, our attendees I know would love to hear as well, a little bit more about Tania and Dinah, if you both want to tell us a little bit more about yourselves. How did you find yourself in your current role? What makes you really passionate, about issues or topics like these?
I'll go ahead and start. Hello, everyone. My name is Dinah Trevil. As Caitlin mentioned, I'm the Senior Program Director for the Office of Cancer Health Equity at Stanford Cancer Institute. So one of the reasons I became very passionate about health equity work is just being in a space to recognize and see very visible inequities from, in the standpoint in the healthcare system, and being committed and dedicated to finding ways to actually address those inequities and those disparities. And one of those ways is what we're going to talk a lot about today, which is the importance of diversity within clinical trials, as well as the healthcare ecosystem at a broader level.
Yeah, and I'm Tania Small. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I'm Tania Small. As Caitlin explains, I oversee the oncology medical program at GSK, but I also chair the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Council. And I mean, there's so many reasons why this is important. Usually when I tell this story it started off, I remember in med school when I looked at risk factors for disease and death. And unfortunately, I remember highlighting things that said Black race. And I remember at that point, I wanted to understand, how could a race be a risk factor for disease and death? And so from then on, I've been on a mission to see how can we understand it? And then most importantly, how can we change it? So to me, this is, and over the last couple of years, you've seen just a big uptick in investments and discussions on how can we solve these problems. So I'm a huge interest in this. And not only am I interested in this, obviously, there's a lot more work and a lot of work we need to do to change this. So glad we're having this discussion, and it's going to be an exciting discussion today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for those introductions. Now, without any further ado, I will give the floor to our moderator, Kiana.
Thanks, Caitlin. Before I started, I did want to go ahead and express both Dinah and Dr. Small's disclaimer statement that while they are employed by outside of ACMA, their views and opinions discussed during this webinar does not reflect the position or the opinion of their employers. Alrighty, so as Caitlin mentioned, my name is Kiana Dixon. I'm the Life Sciences Associate and Pharmacist here at the ACMA. As she mentioned also, with the ACMA, we have a mission, right, to establish that higher level of independent standards. And that includes highlighting and educating the industry on diversity in the healthcare system. This morning, Dr. Small and Dinah will lead the discussion of the importance of diversity and inclusion in the healthcare system. I will first introduce and lay the foundation of the current state of clinical diversity and lack thereof. We'll then go into the guidance to the pharmaceutical industry, specifically in the US, and what this means for trial investigators. Later in the webinar, we'll then move to the discussion portion of the webinar, the decentralized clinical trial model. During this discussion, we'll briefly review this model and its purpose, and our experts on the webinar today, they'll provide their opinions on the potential goals and challenges of retail pharmacies participating in the decentralized clinical trials. We'll also briefly review the standards of the race and ethnicity plan set forth by the FDA. Now, if you have questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to leave them in the Q&A section of your Zoom in the bottom bar of your Zoom window, and we'll address those at the end. These questions that you ask should be specifically for either Dr. Small or Dinah. Any additional questions referring to the ACMA or any content that we have to offer will also be answered directly here during the webinar or to those inquiring via email. All right, so first we'll discuss diversity inclusion in clinical trials and some of those barriers that limit diversity in trial participation. So at this portion, I'll give the floor to Dr. Small for the lack of diversity in clinical trials.
Sure. So obviously for us to tackle a problem, we need to understand what the problem is, and then we start talking about how to solve them. So let's just take a step back and look at the numbers, right? And the numbers speak for themselves. Within the US, community of color make up about 42% of the population. And this is based on the consensus in 2021. However, less than 5% of the clinical trial representation includes people of color. And why is this important? We're going to talk a little bit about even predispositions to different diseases based on ethnicity and race and things like that. And the only way we can solve these problems is if we get these numbers up. So if you go to the next slide, we're going to take a deeper dive on what this looks like. And this is based on the FDA snapshot. And we highlighted here, we really looked at ethnicity. So people of African descent, Asian, and the Hispanic population. You're looking at 8% of clinical trial participation for people of African descent, 6% people of Asian descent, and 11% of Hispanic. But then keep looking, because it's not just ethnicity that shows a lack of diversity. When you look at gender, why is it that only 56% of that, why is it that actually less women make up clinical trials than men? Why is it that when you look at age, why is it that most of them are under 65? And this is really important. I can tell you in oncology, a lot of the diseases, a lot of cancers are affect people older than 65. But there's so many barriers to their participation, and those are the things that we need to address. So if you go to the next slide, this is just a really good example of how specific disease states can be genetically predisposed. And the more we have diversity of clinical trial enrollment, the more we will understand these disease states, the more we'll be able to treat them. So something like BRCA, which is really important. So BCRA mutations, obviously, Ashkenazi Jews are more predisposed. And by having an increase in clinical trial participation of patients that are Ashkenazi Jew, we understood the BRCA mutations more. And we have so many new medicines that really target the BRCA mutation. So by understanding this patient population, we were able to create the right medicines to treat this patient population. And there's numerous of pharmaceutical companies and institutions working on BRCA mutations. So I think we've come a long way in learning how to treat, manage, and cure some of these diseases. When you look at diabetes, you have African American adults 60% more likely to develop diabetes. And also you have an increase in even Hispanic populations with diabetes. And not only are they increased risk of of having diabetes, increased risk of dying from the complications of diabetes. And so how do we create the right medicines that are really targeted to the reason why they have an increased risk and really treat them appropriately? Sickle cell disease, another one. And that's the big area I can tell you a big focus of mine. I mean, over the last maybe 15 years, I've had a big focus on sickle cell disease. And unfortunately, I can tell you for the first 10 years of my focus, there was only one treatment developed for this disease, despite it's only having one mutation. And so now we're moving into cure for sickle cell. We're moving into different ways to actually cure this disease. And then still people do not know about it. We're moving into a lot of different medicines coming to treat this disease. And again, people don't know about it. I think we've come a long way over the last 5 years when it comes to sickle cell treatment, but there's a long way to go. Again, one mutation causing so much havoc. Why are we still having this discussion? So again, this talks more about why we need more enrollment into clinical trials. And again, cervical cancer. Why are people still dying from cervical cancer? We have Hispanic women 40% more likely to be diagnosed with cervical cancer and 26% more likely to die from this disease. And that is unacceptable. So again, the more we enroll in clinical trials, the more we find the right solutions for these problems and the more we get to cure. Now I really want to break down what are the barriers. If you go to the next slide, this is just a high level overview of what are some of the barriers. And I want to be really clear. The barriers are multifactorial. I think most of us have had those discussions about trust being a major issue. And obviously there's a lot of history that resulted in the lack of trust. So much more than that. There are concrete barriers to trial enrollment. And it starts with let's think about the clinical trial design. The eligibility criteria a lot of time knocks out over 20% of people's ability to enroll. When you look at the differences based on ethnicity, based on race, based on age, based on gender, it's a wide variety of predisposed conditions. Our labs tend to differ somewhat. A good example is testosterone. You know that people of African descent, men of African descent tend to have higher levels of testosterone. So if you have a cutoff, for example, in patients with prostate cancer, a lot of them are not eligible to enroll in the trials. When you look at even white blood cell count, we know that, again, African Americans tend to have a lower amount of white blood cell counts. And therefore, a lot of times they're not eligible. If you look at conditions, we said that Hispanics are increased likely to have diabetes, yet a lot of times diabetes are excluded from the eligibility criteria. So there are things that we can do systematically to change and open up their enrollment capabilities of people of color. The other piece is access to clinical trials, and this is on multiple levels. There are logistical issues. When we think about clinical trials, a lot of them are run out of academic institutions. And so when you're in the community, you have to think about the practicality of getting there. And when people are diagnosed with something, it's not like they're waiting to be diagnosed. These are surprises for them. They have their own life. They have their own family. They have a career. Now they have to halt what they're doing to get to these clinical trials. And so it's a lot of times out of their community. We're talking about a transportation issue. If you have kids, we're talking about babysitting. We're talking about a cost factor. There are practical problems and challenges to get to these clinical trials. And the other piece that I like to talk about is really the own institutional level biases. We know that all of us are human, and we know that we all come with our own biases, and physicians are no different. There is a true unconscious bias when it comes to offering patients clinical trial. There was a recent study that showed, I think that was presented at ASCO, where it showed that Black women with breast cancer, when they were asked if they were interested in participating in a clinical trial, 80% of them said yes. And then the next question was, how many of you were asked about a clinical trial? And it was only about 40%, which means that bias really played a factor in their ability to get on clinical trials. So I want us to expand our minds here and go beyond just a trust issue, because that tends to put the responsibility only on the person diagnosed with that particular disease. But let's really attack the things that are in our control as a healthcare community, which is attacking the clinical trial design, making sure that we don't have more labs, more site visits than needed, looking at our eligibility criteria, making sure our consent forms are in multiple languages. Let's look at access to clinical trials. And this is what we're going to talk about during the next phase, is how do we decentralize it so people can get access to it? And then also the true barriers when it comes to unconscious bias. How do we make sure people are trained and actually recognize their own unconscious bias so that they are offering these trials to patients? And if you go to the next slide, this really goes through a few more bullets that or more granularity in terms of the reason why we have more have additional barriers to participation. But I do want to turn it over to my colleague Dinah to see if there's any additional things you want to add before we get into the next section.
Thank you, Dr. Small. I just definitely want to reiterate what you spoke about in terms of being able to really address these barriers for participation and not focusing on the traditional reasoning of trust being the main factor why there's lack of representation of certain groups within clinical trials. So it's important to focus on the barriers that we can address through our healthcare ecosystems and trying to find ways to actually be innovative and address these issues directly within the communities themselves.
And I think it's now over to you, Dinah, or Kiana, to go through the FDA piece and then onto a meatier discussion about decentralization.
Right. So here addressing how is the FDA having a hand in this conversation? You know, they're the drivers of approval of clinical trials, approval of these products that affect diverse populations, all populations here in the US. How are they handling this conversation? Right. As Dr. Small mentioned, clinical trials, they're important, right? Clinical trials, they're expected to reflect the population affected for best results and relatable outcomes. These trials that are conducted, they're conducted globally, and many are focused here within the US. If we want to trust that a product is beneficial to a disease state, healthcare providers, they should look for data most representative and reflective of the patient populations that they treat and work with. You know, as a participant in this conversation, the FDA, they've actually released a draft guidance for the industry. Right, this guidance, it recommends clinical trial investigators to include in their applications of review a specific plan, a race and ethnicity plan, to directly address on how specific factors that we mentioned previously are being addressed in these proposed clinical trials. So from the perspective of the industry, they urge and recommend that teams include this in the design of their clinical trial, from eligibility criteria to addressing those barriers of access of trial sites to specific populations. You know, from the perspective of a healthcare provider, it's urged to review these clinical trial designs in your review of your data that will eventually affect your patient population. So what some in the industry, in the healthcare industry, are doing to address some of these barriers are welcoming the concept of decentralized clinical trials. Right, so this directly addresses one of those main barriers we mentioned earlier, right? Access to those clinical trials. A study recently showed that 67% of consumers were less likely to participate in the clinical trial, specifically for COVID-19 treatment, if they actually had to travel outside of their local area to a travel site, because they have to deal with those barriers that we mentioned before. You know, transportation. During the pandemic time, no one wanted to leave anyway. So addressing those direct barriers to transportation to those clinical trial sites. Decentralized clinical trials, they're an attempt to ease participation for patients by reducing or eliminating that need to travel to study sites, right? So one of those decentralized clinical trial sites that we're seeing are popping up now are the involvement of retail pharmacies. You know, even during the pandemic, many of us have continued to regularly visit the pharmacy because we needed to, right? We had to. In rural locations, the pharmacists, they know almost everyone that visits. And oftentimes patients, they may feel more comfortable visiting their pharmacy than their doctor's office for a quicker consultation. In one place, right? In one place at a retail pharmacy, we find an important healthcare provider, the pharmacist. We can find miscellaneous items like batteries and even groceries. So, in other words, healthcare items and products that we use on a regular basis are accessible. So, why not expand this location to make clinical trials more accessible? And that's what we're seeing with decentralized clinical trials, specifically at those retail pharmacies. Now, while the goal of decentralized clinical trials are to reduce travel time for participants, offering retail pharmacies to be the location of this trial site is dependent on exactly where the pharmacy is located in relation to the patient. And so it can be seen as a goal or a challenge. You know, Dr. Small, Dinah, this is where our discussion is on your benefits that you may see of retail pharmacies participating in decentralized clinical trials. You know, what do you think are those benefits or the goals that we see for retail pharmacies?
I believe there can be some, with these goals, it could be some benefits to actually to this model. Of course, contingent upon, like you mentioned, location of these retail pharmacies. Oftentimes in certain communities, there are there's a lack of other locations where you're talking about grocery stores, pharmacies. They're not necessarily as available as in other communities. So particularly in communities where there may not be as many locations. So that, although that's a great goal, as long as their availability of those pharmacies are there for the community, then it could be a goal. I also think that they just have to make sure that they're also have the pharmacists ready and accessible to be able to actually be able to facilitate these clinical trials and not have the instance where there's a challenge between actually distributing the medication that the patients need and versus the clinical trial. So I think with the proper infrastructure, these goals could work, but we still have to make sure that that we still have to be make sure that the barriers that exist are addressed before it really being able to implement such trials.
Yeah, I mean, and I think even in terms of goals, one of the biggest opportunities, and you spoke about it a little bit, Kiana, is you get to have real world patients on this, right? Because part of as I mentioned before, the biggest barrier is getting to an academic institution. And because of that, our representation tends to be very skewed. And also, I think, and we spoke about knowledge of the trial and being offered the trial, because it's now in their communities. We will know, the patients within the communities will now have access to offerings of the trial. So I think that is twofold in terms of goals and actual potential. It's the travel piece, yeah. So you don't have to leave your community. I think you'll actually have more representation of your community that actually are offering the trial as well, which is also a piece that I didn't speak about. But when you look at the principal investigators for clinical trials, a lot of them do not look like members of the community. But because it is in their community, you'll have hopefully increased representation of those people who are running the trials at the local level. And then also they'll get access and offer the trial. So I think you're going to start seeing with this whole decentralization of clinical trials, you should start seeing a real representation of what the patient population look like that has the disease.
So within that, Dr. Small, you mentioned, those principal investigators, they don't look like the goal participant population. With that, do we also need more education on both sides? So the investigation side as well as, the participants or the enrollees for the trial?
100%. So, I mean, as I mentioned before, part of it is the physicians that are offering the trial, that them broad spectrum of patients, the clinical trial for their own biases or just lack of awareness. But also, we do know that the principal investigators a lot of times do not look like the patient population that has the disease when you're looking at the diversity of PIs. One of the things that, again, as we think about solution or being oriented is really upskilling and offering diverse PIs the opportunity to participate in clinical trials. And that has been, I know that we're starting to shine a spotlight on that. But the fact is, when you look at the principal investigators of a trial, for the most part, they're not people of color. By going into the communities, I think we increase that opportunity of having those people more local run the clinical trials within their own community once we start decentralizing. So I think that's an upside as well. So we will have not just more diverse patients, but we'll have more diverse principal investigators running the clinical trial.
So I know we also mentioned here some of these challenges, right? The challenges to retail pharmacies participating in these clinical trials. What other challenges do you foresee, or do you have that certain pharmaceutical companies or trial investigators will need to circumvent in order for these to be successful?
Do you want to take that, Dina? Then I'll follow up.
Yeah. So I think I see technology mentioned very often. I think that's a major challenge. So just making sure that the technology is actually not only in place, but in a format that is user-friendly and can be used with someone at any level of technology, and recognizing that that in certain communities or in the communities that the trials may are aimed to take place, there may not be access to any technology outside of perhaps the phone, if even a smartphone. So making sure that there are procedures in place to be able to address that void.
Yeah.
Thank you. Dr. Small, did you have anything to add?
No, I mean, I think you and Dina really covered it. I mean, I think the protocol compliance, when you look at the challenges, the protocol compliance is actually really big, and even just oversight, right? Because part of the challenge when we're running clinical trials is the data has to be clean, and there needs to be a real tight oversight over the data and data collection and monitoring. And so that may be a challenge. So I think it's just a watch out, something that we just have to make sure we do well. And I think we're going to have trial and error. I don't think we're going to get it right all the time, but I think that's probably another challenge. It's really making sure that there's strong oversight, making sure that the face-to-face interactions with the patient, because we still want to make sure there is some kind of face-to-face interactions with these patients. And so you want to make sure they're getting the right care, getting their questions answered in the right way. So those are potential challenges, but it's nothing that we can't overcome.
Thank you.
I think just to add to what Dr. Small mentioned, in that with the training and in terms of protocol compliance, making sure that that's across the board in any pharmacy staff, as well as that's involved in the actual trial itself, in addition to from the actual institution or healthcare system that is actually initiating the trial.
So I see it sounds like we need a lot of collaborative work, a lot of communication, open communication, but also education across the board. It's not just the industry, it's not just the clinical trial investigators, both sides, the investigators, those at the sites, and also the patients. So it looks like we're approaching this 30-minute mark, and we actually have a few questions that are coming in that I wanted to address. And some of them are probably addressed directly to these challenges that we've discussed already here for the decentralized clinical trials. Now, the first question, I'll go ahead and I'll address these for both of you. You could just jump in and let me know what answers or opinions that you have. The first question that came in, I work in medical affairs. How can I participate and stay involved in ensuring diversity for clinical trials? I can speak on this, from an ACMA's point of view. Within our mission, one of our main services that we offer is education and training, right? Providing insights to all of pharmaceutical organizations and individuals in medical affairs, from speaking to industry experts and leaders and forming this education and training that we do offer. Within ACMA, we recently released the Diversity in Clinical Trials course, right? So this is something that some teams have enrolled into to spill out to all of their medical affairs teams, so that all of their medical affairs professionals are educated so that they can hold a conversation with research and development, those clinical trial investigators that they speak to these important points that we discussed earlier. Another question we have, I think this will be pretty good for you guys. What are ways?
Wait, I can actually also add on to that, right? Because
okay.
I mean, to your point, I think that so much has already been done, and you've already pulled a lot of the resources and nicely bundled it for it to be digestible for us to learn what can be done, how to do it, and I think the onus is on all of us. You asked, how can I participate? So it's definitely the education, and ACMA has done a phenomenal job in packaging and educating and talking about ways in which we can do it. I think the other piece is feeling accountable to make the change within our own institution. Or to even add to the progress of our institution, because I do think a lot of companies are starting to move in this direction. I think raising the flag to your R&D colleagues and saying, let's look at each protocol. Let's not just cut and paste protocol to protocol. Let's do a full sweep to see, are we being inclusive enough? And we're talking about true inclusive research, right? For long-term equity, right? That is what we're trying to do. So look and make sure our eligibility criteria are inclusive. And that is something that's easy. It takes a little bit of time, a little bit of work, but let's stop cutting and pasting and going through it. Simple as asking the question about your consent form. Is it in one language, or does it encompass other languages? Are we making sure that we're attaching a budget if we need to translate, so that you have people where English is not their first language feel comfortable understanding and signing up and consenting? And I think the other piece is making sure within your institution that, to Kiana's point, that there's training being done both internally and externally. And then the other piece is, I think there's ways in which we can make sure that we lift the burden off of a lot of the patients when it comes to coming in. Can we, number one, decrease the amount of visits, study visits? But the other thing is, are we putting in even like trial material that looks like them, right? Does it just look like one group of people, your trial material? Does it look like the spectrum of people that have the disease? Those are I think the house cleaning that we can do and that we can own individually as medical affairs leaders within our organization.
I agree. Thank you, Dr. Small. Did you have anything, Dinah, for medical affairs teams or the pharma side?
Well, I was just going to say, just to add on to Dr. Small's point is that education and training is key, but also taking it a step further and making sure that there are policies in place to implement that education and put it into practice. So oftentimes I think we get boggled down in a lot of trainings, but don't take the extra step to actually make sure that things get put into practice and implemented. So as Dr. Small mentioned, from the beginning, in terms of study design, having a sweep and maybe a committee or some type of review, and ensuring that that the criteria is not one of the barriers. Inclusion criteria is not one of the barriers in terms of diversity, or making sure that whatever other you put it in place to make sure that it allows for diversity within the trials, and doing that from the initial phase, at study design, so that it's not an afterthought and then thinking, oh wow, we've started this trial and we don't have the proper representation.
Yeah. And I think going into looking at the second question, but I think even to your point, and once we do that, what is our recruitment plan to make sure that we are recruiting diverse patients? And can we assign a KPI and hold hold our teams accountable on delivering it. I've once seen cases where, I mean, if you think about, there's a balance between quickly recruiting for a trial to get it to read out so we can actually get drug to patients and treatment to patients. But, and I think some of the feedback I tend to hear is, and again, this is me speaking outside of GSK, but just in general, is if we wait to recruit diverse patients, it will slow down the recruitment of a trial. No, I think, again, making sure you're putting your trial within the patient population that actually has a disease within that community. And then we can make sure we keep our trials open for enrollment until we hit the number that we're targeting. A lot of times we'll shut down a study because we hit the total number and not really look at the patient population or diversity of patient population that's in the trial. I say we push the institutions to hold trials open until we actually recruit the diverse patient population that we're aiming to recruit. So that means a lot of ahead planning, a lot of recruitment planning, and then holding and actually, I guess, digging in our heels or not quickly closing out trials until we meet our KPIs. And it's going to take very bold institutions to do that, but I think we can do that, and I've seen it being done, and it works.
Yeah, that definitely does address that second question that came in. Just for those on the webinar, the question was, what are ways pharmaceutical companies are holding teams accountable to ensure that they're doing concrete things to improve diversity in clinical trials?
Yeah, I think we hold ourselves accountable, and we do not budge if we're serious about doing this. Because I think the more we say we're going to, for example, hold these trials open until we recruit the diverse patient population, I think the quicker institutions will put their diverse patients on trial. And also we can hold institutions accountable. If they promise to recruit X amount of diverse patients, hold them accountable. They need to recruit X amount of diverse patient population, or else guess what? They don't get used again. So I think we need to make sure that in our institutions we're serious, but also with our partners that are PIs, we need to make sure that they understand that we're serious about this.
I agree. And, a good follow-up to that, when developing these goals, or here's a question though, what are those effective ways to setting them in the first place, developing in the first place to ensure that diversity is being accounted for, which stakeholders should all be involved in the development of those goals? I know you mentioned earlier research and development, for example.
I think all of us. I think all of us are. I think what we do is, because you can't attack everything, right? I think the first piece is really understanding the patient population that actually has the disease you're working on, and then what's the prevalence of it, and then actually creating a recruitment goal to actually have that same amount of diverse patient population that actually have disease. I think it starts there, right? That's factual. X amount of, we know the demographics of the disease. We understand who has the disease. Let's make sure we're creating a recruitment plan to have that same representation on our clinical trial. I think that's the first piece. So if you say, for example, people of African descent have about 5% of them actually have the disease, then we need to make sure that you're recruiting 5% into your clinical trial for that particular disease. And then after that, you create a whole recruitment plan on how to do it. And then what are your KPIs to make sure that it's done? And then that's where I think the piece is not budging and holding ourselves accountable to deliver on that KPI. But it's going to be both a bottom up and a top down approach, right? We need to make sure we push from the bottom up, but we also make sure that our leaders buy in, and our leaders are going to hold themselves accountable for those deliveries. And I think we can do that. I'm looking at multiple institutions, and you're seeing that being done across the board. So my biggest fear is right now, everyone is all in to do this. We need to make sure that continues to grow. So I think everyone on this call, let's make sure that we're very clear on who has a disease, what is our recruitment plan, how do we build the KPIs, and then how do we make sure we communicate that and hold ourselves accountable to deliver on that KPI.
And I think also just to add to that, I think it's important to recognize that may require some diversity within the recruitment plan itself, just because there's not necessarily the same approach you would use, to recruit, members of, the African American community or another community of color that you use broadly for the trial itself. So I think that's also something to keep into mind with that recruitment plan.
Completely agree.
Yeah. That actually addressed another question that came in. The question was, how are companies ensuring that there is an equitable spread across various demographics? And so that directly addresses that question in that issue as well. A really good question here that came in too, addressing telehealth for clinical trial participation. Has there been a discussion about using telehealth or remote monitoring to increase clinical trial participation?
Dina, do you want to go first, and I can?
Yes. So I think that there has been maybe some discussion in terms of potentially using this as another method for to increase diversity for clinical trial participation. I don't know that there's really been anything concrete put into place in terms of really being able to move forward with it, but I know that there has been some discussion about it. Of course, at some point, there still has to be, some in-person contact, for any of the trials, but that may be a good starting point in terms of being able to capture certain audiences. I don't know if Dr. Small has anything she'd like to add.
Yeah, I think so. I can tell you, I've seen it being done for a few trials. I've done it. Again, this is me. Not at GSK, but I've done it. And I think actually maybe a few pharmaceutical companies are starting to partner and do this as well. And it's not, I've seen it being done. I've seen the recruitment being done, particularly because in rural areas, when you're trying to recruit for sometimes even more common diseases, and I've seen it successful. So I do think some institutions are doing it. I think both from having a central, the way I've seen it is more of a central institution working with telehealth groups to actually to recruit more patients deeper in the communities and more rural communities. And I've seen them collect the data. I've seen it's been we still will need to tighten the oversight over it again, but it's been successful and it's reached deeper into the communities. I think people who would not have been able to go to academic centers to participate in clinical trials. I just think we need to get the information out there and figure out ways to spread it across more pharmaceutical companies and more academic institutions.
I think telehealth and remote learning is a great tool and a great resource for elderly populations, those who can't travel or they don't have a caregiver that can. And it's also, it's really good for multiple populations. Or if you're in a rural area, you don't have a close site near you. This is a really good way to monitor and still have that real world data, the real world data of a real world population, I guess you could say, within the clinical trial.
I agree. And it works, right? And it works. And I think actually COVID has taught us a lot of things that taught us a lot of things that can work. So I think it works pretty well. It's just now just tightening the screws on it to make sure that we can replicate it and expand and scale it, but it works.
All right, so just to wrap up the discussion, I have one more question here that's sitting in. What role can pharma play within the community to improve diversity?
It's a big question. I'm saying diversity in trials, or are we talking about diversity in science or research or inclusive research? I think when you look at the work that pharma is doing right now, I have to say I'm pretty impressed. And I say this because I've been focusing quite a bit on inclusive research, maybe for the last 10 or 15 years. Over the last, I would say 3 years, 4 years, I've seen just this big uptick in investment and outreach into the community. And when I say that, I'm not talking about just words. I'm talking about they're putting their money where their mouth is. I've seen so many pharmaceutical companies invest millions upon millions in trying to do a few things. And that's get trials within the community, recruitment better from the community, but also invest in the science within a community. I mean, think about the amount of money that you see pharma even investing in HBCUs, investing in medical schools, investing in mentorships to really to give community of colors a leg up. So there's been a huge investment in STEM, investment in even educating more diverse physicians. I think that if we look at the change or the evolution of investment into the communities, you would see a huge growth over the last 5 years. So what role can we play? I think it's all about, number one, partnering, understanding and partnering with the communities, and understand that we have one goal, and that is obviously to improve the health of patients around the world, and not just for selected patients. And once we agree on our goal, it's about holding hands and saying, what does each community need in order to do that? And it has to be a conscious effort. And I see it happening. And I'm pretty impressed. There's always more that we can do, but I think we're on the right track. I think we are partnering with patient advocacy groups. I think we're partnering with physicians. We're partnering with institutions. We're partnering with science programs. We're partnering with colleges. We're partnering a lot. And I think it's going to be also important for the communities to speak up and say, what do they need? And what more do they need from pharma? And how do they want to partner? So that it's a two-way partnership and not just one way.
I think I'll just, add on to that and say, definitely, and that is making sure that investment is there, as Dr. Small mentioned, and making sure that investment is sustainable. So not, there's a lot of, push right now, and there's a lot of investment right now, and making sure that it doesn't dwindle down and kind of die out after a couple of years. And making sure also, as Dr. Small mentioned, that there's that community input and buy-in, because without the community input and buy-in, oftentimes they're still going to get that. Then you'll have that reluctance, in terms of participation, because they'll feel like, okay, this wasn't really about us. It's not really about, our priorities and what's, going on in the community. So making sure that there's that bi-directional communication.
Yeah, well, I mean, that I think is so important too, because the first piece that we spoke about was the trust, and making sure the voices of the community are heard, respected, understood, and addressed. So the partnership goes all the way to the people of the community. So yeah, I completely agree that that's critical.
Great. Well, I wanted to conclude this webinar for us today. Thank you so much for our audience for all of your questions. A special thank you to Dr. Small and Dinah for giving such wonderful insight on these issues and these topics today. Thanks, Kiana, as well. And thank you for all of our attendees for joining us. Be sure to follow us on LinkedIn and YouTube, and check out our website at medicalafairsspecialist.org for more information about the ACMA. Join us for our next webinar in February, where we will be discussing the future of medical affairs tools, trends, and resources. Let's continue to raise the bar together. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.